The wind that swept across the steppe carried more than dust. It carried the sound of endings, the hiss of extinguished fires, the low moan of dying horses, and the faint sobs that trembled beneath the weight of silence. In the distance, the horizon burned, not with the color of dawn, but with the color of ruin. Charred beams jutted from the earth like broken ribs, and what had once been a village lay flattened beneath the boots of riders who did not slow down, who did not look back, who believed mercy was an insult to conquest. Amid the ashes, a woman knelt beside the body of her husband. His armor split open like a desecrated shrine. The Mongol banner fluttered above her, a black horse head silhouette against a red sky. And in that flicker of wind, the Empire's philosophy revealed itself in its purest form. Life meant submission, and resistance was to be erased, not simply killed, but rewritten. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of iron. A single Mongol commander rode through the remains of the street, his expression unreadable beneath a layer of dust. He dismounted not to comfort, but to count. To him, the women were not victims. They were assets, living symbols of conquest, proof that the Mongol name would continue through the blood of those they conquered. Around him, the soldiers waited silently, their discipline more frightening than rage. They had learned that terror was most effective when it was methodical, when it looked like order rather than chaos. The woman lifted her eyes to meet his gaze, and in that moment she understood the truth whispered across Asia. Death was not the worst fate that followed the Mongol banner. For the wives of fallen warriors, death was a privilege denied. What awaited them was a system built not merely to destroy, but to unmake. It was conquest that reached beyond the body, conquest that invaded memory, identity, and even lineage. The Mongols had mastered something darker than the sword, the art of turning life itself into punishment. Before we descend into the shadowed pages of this history, into the rituals, decrees, and horrors that made the Mongol name synonymous with fear, hit subscribe and prepare to witness what history tried to bury. Because what Mongols did to the wives of defeated warriors was truly worse than death. To understand the scale of what was unleashed across the world beneath the hooves of Mongol horses, one must first understand that their empire was not born of savagery, but of system. The Mongol conquest began not as an act of chaos, but as a meticulously engineered reordering of the human world. When Temujin, the man history would call Genghis Khan, united the fractious clans of the steppe, he did so not merely through bloodshed, but through a code that turned cruelty into law and subjugation into philosophy. It was called the Yasa, and though little of it survives, its essence still vibrates through the chronicles written by those who trembled beneath its reach. The Yasa taught that loyalty was absolute, that the Khan's will was divine law, and that the conquered were not just defeated, they were absorbed. Their identity is consumed and rewritten in the service of empire. Every war, every village burned, every family broken, was part of a grand design to create a world where only one order existed, that of the horsemen who came from the east. The Mongol Empire at its height stretched from the edges of the Korean peninsula to the plains of Hungary, swallowing entire civilizations like a storm front devouring the horizon. It was a force of both destruction and transformation, a paradox that built trade routes while leaving continents smoldering. Too many chroniclers, Persian, Chinese, and Arab alike, the Mongols were both the hand of God and its scourge, a people who prayed with one hand and slaughtered with the other. Behind their victories was not chaos but structure. The Mongols organized their army in units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, each one bound by unbreakable discipline and loyalty. To disobey an order was to die without hesitation. To retreat was to be executed. To show mercy was considered weakness. Their conquests followed a rhythm so consistent it resembled a ritual. Approach, encircle, annihilate, and rebuild in their image. Yet the battlefield was only half the conquest. The other half began once the swords fell silent. It was in the aftermath that the Mongols' truest weapon revealed itself: fear. Their wars were not fought merely against armies, but against the concept of resistance itself. Cities that surrendered were sometimes spared, but their people were never free. Those who defied were exterminated. Their blood turned into a warning. When Nishapur fell in 1221 after days of siege, the chroniclers wrote that Genghis Khan's forces slaughtered every man, woman, and child in retaliation for his slain commander, stacking skulls and pyramids so high that the earth beneath turned pale with bone dust. When MV was captured, the same policy was followed. Engineered extermination calculated to erase defiance from memory. But among the survivors, one group was never simply killed. The wives, daughters, and mothers of fallen warriors were taken alive, not out of compassion, but out of purpose. To the Mongols, women represented continuity. In the cultures they conquered, women were vessels of lineage, carriers of bloodlines that could resurrect rebellion through sons and brothers. And whispered stories, killing them ended a life, possessing them ended a civilization. Thus, Mongol conquest evolved into a psychological weapon, where women became both trophies and tools. Chroniclers like Abd-al-Malik Juvani and Rashid Allen, writing under Persian and Islamic courts, recorded stories of how noble women were distributed among commanders, how daughters of kings were given as wives to low-ranking soldiers as gestures of total humiliation, and how entire dynasties ended not by execution, but by enforced marriage. The Mongols were pragmatic. They did not destroy beauty. They rebranded it under their seal. A captured queen was not executed. She was paraded, renamed, and reborn as a consort to those who had slaughtered her kin. It was an empire not of nations, but of blood. The aftermath of conquest was ritualized to the point of ceremony. After cities fell, the Mongol quartermasters would assemble the captives. Men separated from women, children sorted by age, artisans marked for enslavement, and soldiers executed. The women of warriors, however, were classified according to a different logic. They were not prisoners of war. They were resources destined to serve not only the needs of the army, but also the continuity of Mongol dominance. Some were forced into service camps that traveled with the army, cooking, nursing, tending, and bearing children who would be raised as Mongols. Others were selected for the courts of the Khan's elite, where beauty became both currency and curse. Those of noble birth were forced into marriage contracts to erase dynastic identity, their names replaced with Mongol titles. In their eyes, submission was a scar more permanent than any wound, a mark of defeat that stretched through generations. Even the Mongol understanding of divinity justified the cycle. They believed the eternal blue sky, Tengri, had granted them dominion over all beneath it. This was not arrogance, it was conviction. Every conquest was framed as divine right. Every humiliation as a sacred order. To resist was blasphemy. To suffer was inevitable. When the wives of fallen princes and generals were taken, the Mongols saw no cruelty, only balance. The transference of power through possession. To them, a woman who bore a child of her conqueror had fulfilled divine law by merging conquered blood with that of the chosen people. But to those women, the act was not divine. It was the annihilation of self, the final act in a war that no longer required weapons. It is here that the story turns from history to horror, because what began as conquest of territory soon became conquest of humanity itself. The Mongols' genius lay not merely in how they fought, but in how they understood psychology. The ability to destroy the will of a people by ensuring that even survival became a punishment. In this empire of silence, where obedience was born from despair and identity was reshaped through terror, the wives of fallen warriors became living testaments to what it meant to be conquered by the steppe. Their lives were not spared out of mercy, but out of method. Their suffering was not random. It was institutionalized, encoded, and repeated until it became tradition. And so, as cities fell and kings vanished, the cycle deepened. Every victory birthed a new class of captives, and every captive woman carried the echo of her people's eraser. Beneath the banners of the Great Khan, the empire's foundations were written not just in blood, but in lineage corrupted and rewritten. The chronicles speak often of the Mongols' military genius, their administrative brilliance, and their mastery of trade and law. Yet hidden between the lines of those same texts is another truth, one that no historian dares to celebrate, that the true power of the Mongol Empire lay in what it did after victory, and how it turned survival itself into submission. And for the wives of the defeated, that submission was a fate far darker than death. When a Mongol army surrounded a city, time itself seemed to slow. The people inside knew what was coming. Every scream that drifted over the walls from the siege lines was a prophecy of what their own streets would soon sound like. The air was filled with the constant rhythm of drums, not for intimidation alone, but for synchronization, the heartbeat of a machine that never faltered. Siege towers moved with mathematical precision. The archers fired in coordinated waves, and when the gates finally fell, the silence that followed was more dreadful than the chaos before it. The Mongols believed that the first moments after a city has fallen define the next 100 years of its memory. Their entrance was not a riot, it was a performance. Men were cut down in lines, their blood used to mark thresholds. Monks, scholars, and priests were all slaughtered to extinguish a city's soul before its walls even stopped burning. And then, when the smoke thinned, came the true ceremony, the gathering of the living. The women were driven into open courtyards, the same courtyards where their husbands had once sworn oaths of loyalty or prayed for protection. There, beneath the fluttering banners of their conquerors, they were ordered to kneel in neat rows as Mongol officers rode past, cataloging them like a living inventory. The sound of the horses' hooves on broken stone mixed with the sobs of children who clung to their mothers. Behind the riders came scribes who recorded what was seen: age, beauty, social standing, and the marks of wealth in jewelry or clothing. To the Mongols, this was not cruelty, but order, not violation, but classification. A noble woman was valuable for ransom or alliance. A commoner's daughter might serve as labor or, worse, as comfort for soldiers. Those who resisted were struck down on the spot, their death serving as instruction for the rest. No one spoke after the first execution. Silence was easier to survive than defiance. In that moment, the city's identity ceased to exist. Names dissolved into categories, heritage into utility. The conqueror's efficiency transformed catastrophe into bureaucracy. The Mongol officer who held the tally did not think himself a monster. He was a functionary in the empire's engine of conquest, ensuring that every captured life was assigned purpose. In the chronicles of Juvenal and Rashid Allen, this phase was often referred to in sanitized language: the ordering of captives, the division of spoils, and the pacification of the conquered. But between those lines lies the unspoken reality. What these women endured was not merely domination, but deletion. The fall of their city was the beginning of an existence that erased all meaning except survival. Once the smoke cleared, the Mongols performed what they considered an act of justice, the redistribution of what conquest had granted. The division of captives was done under command, following the chain of hierarchy with the same precision as their battle formations. At the top stood the generals, who chose first not out of lust but to symbolize their share in the divine favor of victory. Below them came officers, then ordinary soldiers, each permitted to claim from the spoils according to rank and merit. Women were not viewed as individuals but as instruments of reward and obedience. For the Mongol commanders, to give or take a woman was to extend authority. To be denied one was a form of punishment. Thus, every act of possession became a mirror of power, a ritual that reaffirmed who ruled and who obeyed. The chosen women were brought to the camps, their wrists bound with silk cords, a gesture that seemed gentle but carried the weight of ownership. They were not to be harmed, without permission, for they were no longer human beings in the ordinary sense. They were property sanctified by conquest. Many chroniclers remarked upon the Mongols' contradictory behavior, disciplined in their organization, yet merciless in their control. They would forbid theft or assault within their ranks, but they would not recognize the humanity of those taken. A woman who belonged to an enemy was now the vessel of a new lineage. Her body was the battlefield upon which the empire's continuity was written. The Mongols believed that blood conquered land, but flesh conquered legacy. Those of royal or noble descent suffered a particular kind of humiliation. Their beauty, which once symbolized power and refinement, now drew the attention of men who saw it as a prize to desecrate. A captured princess might find herself presented as a gift to a Khan's cousin or married to a minor officer to demonstrate that the empire could collapse dynasties with a gesture. The act was political theater, and erasure played out in the language of intimacy. A woman who had once ruled a household, commanded servants, or walked among marble halls was now ordered to kneel before tents smelling of sweat and horsehide. Even in the degradation, the Mongols maintained discipline. There was no drunken chaos, no uncontrolled frenzy. The horror lay in the calmness of it all, the procedural precision with which dignity was dismantled. When morning came, the women were moved again, distributed along the caravan routes or confined to temporary encampments. Each transfer stripped another layer of their former identity until memory itself began to fracture. The Mongols did not kill them because death would end the lesson too soon. They wanted submission to become instinct, something inherited by the next generation. For the empire to endure, the conquered had to believe that resistance was unnatural. Thus, the ritual of ownership became more than a moment of conquest. It became the foundation of psychological control. And in that system, the wives of defeated warriors were the living proof that even love, fidelity, and lineage could be colonized. What began as the seizure of captives evolved into something far more systematic. Across the vast expanse of Mongol dominion, from the steppes of Central Asia to the Persian plains, the empire established controlled settlements for managing its human spoils. Historians later described these as service encampments, but survivors' accounts painted them as something closer to factories of assimilation. Women taken from conquered cities were transported in groups, sometimes hundreds at a time, to remote sites near rivers or mountain passes, where Mongol detachments would rest between campaigns. There, under the watch of guards and midwives, the empire began its quietest conquest, the transformation of bloodlines. These camps operated with disturbing order. Each woman was assigned according to origin, appearance, and perceived fertility. The Mongols believed that to blend conquered blood with their own was to strengthen the empire's divine mandate. A child born from such unions would carry both the vigor of the steppe and the endurance of the settled lands, a being destined to serve the eternal sky for the women. However, this ideology translated into a nightmare without language. They live in cycles of command and conception, their identities reduced to biological purpose. There were no names, only numbers and symbols burned into wooden tablets. Contemporary chroniclers avoided the tale, preferring euphemisms like marriage integration or repopulation policy. But the truth, preserved in fragments of local folklore and monastic records, reveals something far darker. Some women refused to eat, hoping starvation might grant escape. Others drowned themselves in rivers or hanged from the wooden fences that enclosed them. To the guards, these acts were not tragedies, but inefficiencies. New captives always arrived. The machine of empire required fresh flesh to sustain itself. The camps became microcosms of the Mongol world, clean, organized, and silent. The wind that passed through their tents carried lullabies sung by mothers who knew their children would grow to speak the language of their conquerors and forget the prayers of their ancestors. In these places, survival itself became an act of resistance. Yet even resistance was futile. To live was to yield. To die was to vanish. Generations later, entire regions of Central Asia bore the traces of these policies. Ethnic and genetic blending so deep that the original identities could never be fully recovered. The Mongols did not simply conquer geography. They rewrote biology through those camps. The wives of defeated warriors became instruments of imperial design, and their children became living evidence that submission could be inherited if the camps were hidden. There were also horrors performed in the open. In cities that resisted fiercely or killed Mongol envoys, punishment was designed to be witnessed. The Mongols understood that terror spread best through sight. In conquered capitals such as Samarkand, Urgent, and Kiev, they staged spectacles of humiliation that blended military ceremony with ritual degradation. Highborn women, wives of princes, commanders, and scholars, were paraded before the surviving populace, as proof that no one stood beyond the reach of the Khan's will. Clothed in remnants of their finery, stripped of jewelry and identity, they were made to serve wine to the victors at banquets held atop the ruins of their palaces. The chroniclers say that laughter echoed louder than drums. To the Mongols, the laughter was sacred. It was the sound of fear breaking, of pride dissolving. Each of these acts carried symbolism. By transforming noble women into servants, the Mongols inverted the social order. What had once been revered was now common, and what had once been untouchable was now public property. There were no individual punishments. Every humiliation was collective. The people were forced to watch as symbols of their civilization became props in a theater of power. Some accounts describe women forced to dance before the soldiers who had slaughtered their families. Others tell of public marriages between conquerors and captives staged for the amusement of the crowd. The goal was not pleasure but pedagogy to teach through degradation. That resistance against the Mongols was defiance against destiny itself. And yet beneath the spectacle something else stirred, a quiet form of rebellion that did not shout, but endured. Some women used their positions within Mongol courts to smuggle information, to poison, and to sabotage from within. A few rose to prominence as advisors or wives of influence, turning the weapon of marriage into an instrument of survival. Yet even their power carried the echo of violation. Their authority existed only through assimilation. They were celebrated not as survivors of conquest, but as proof of Mongol benevolence. Their stories became distorted legends of love and mercy, rewritten to justify domination. For every tale of a queen spared, there were hundreds of unnamed women whose voices were buried beneath the banners of victory. By the time the Mongol Empire reached its zenith, humiliation had become an art form precise, symbolic, and unforgettable. The wives of fallen warriors no longer needed chains. Their silence was enough. Generations grew up believing that the Mongols were not conquerors, but fate itself, that their power was as inevitable as sunrise, and in that acceptance lay the deepest horror of all. When oppression no longer needed force, only memory. When the wars finally subsided and peace settled like dust over the ruins, the true aftermath began. The cities rebuilt their walls, the markets reopened, and trade flowed again along the Silk Road. But beneath the surface of prosperity, something spectral remained. Across Central Asia and the Middle East, stories began to circulate in whispers of women who wandered the steppes at night, calling out names long erased, of shadows that clung to Mongol camps and wailed during storms. Folklore merged with trauma, giving birth to myths of vengeful spirits, the wives of the fallen who had refused to die. Some said their souls were trapped between worlds, unable to rest because their bodies had been used as vessels of conquest. Others claimed that the horses of Mongol patrols would sometimes refuse to move at night, sensing the presence of the unburied. Even centuries later, chroniclers noticed that certain places remained shunned by local people, rivers where captives had drowned themselves, and fields where the wind always seemed colder. The collective memory of the Mongol conquest did not fade. It calcified into cultural scar, tissue, and Persian poetry. The motif of the captive bride became a symbol of lost nations. In Chinese and Arabic writings, the Mongols were described as both human and supernatural men who had harnessed the wrath of heaven. But beneath those myths lay the truth that ordinary women had borne the empire's deepest cruelty. Their suffering became the grammar through which future generations remembered defeat, yet history, in its relentless march, often rewards power and forgets pain. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured, absorbed by the very cultures it had once enslaved.
Trade routes flourished. Art and law evolved, and the descendants of conquerors married into the bloodlines of the conquered. The world moved on, but memory is patient. The silence of those women, their erased names, and their unspoken stories linger like ghosts within every chronicle that praises Mongol greatness. They remind us that empire is never only about banners and borders. It is about the quiet, methodical destruction of identity. And so, as centuries passed, the phrase worse than death ceased to be metaphorical. It became historical truth. For the wives of defeated warriors, survival was not life. It was a slow unmaking, a transformation into instruments of another's glory. Their children would carry the conqueror's blood, their stories rewritten as legend, their tears evaporated by the endless wind of the steppe. The Mongols conquered the world with their armies, but they secured it with something far darker: the annihilation of memory itself. As the Mongol Empire expanded beyond imagination, swallowing entire civilizations like waves devouring shorelines, its brutality evolved into something more deliberate, more refined, and almost ritualistic in its logic. What had begun as a method of fear had now matured into a theology of domination. And nowhere was this theology more evident than in the treatment of those left behind by the fallen. The wives of men whose courage had defied the Khan's order to kneel. The empire's strength was measured not merely by the number of bodies it piled into pyramids of skulls, but by how completely it could break the spirit of a nation without needing to spill its last drop of blood. For the Mongols' war did not end when the enemy's army was crushed. True conquest began when his legacy was rewritten, when his bloodline was no longer his own, when even the memory of his name became property of the victors. The wives of defeated warriors became the final battlefield, human landscapes upon which the empire engraved its most enduring victories. There are stories buried within the Persian chronicles and the Chinese annals that historians have long glossed over, dismissing them as exaggerations or poetic embellishments. Yet, across too many sources and too many languages, the patterns align with chilling precision. When a defeated ruler was captured alive, the Mongols often devised punishments that transcended physical pain, turning his personal world into a theater of psychological annihilation. One account speaks of a Turk general forced to witness the public defilement of his wife and daughters before being trampled beneath horses. His body was crushed under the same hooves that had once carried his armies. Another tells of noble women in the Khwarezmian court paraded before their husbands' executioners. Their faces veiled not in modesty but in shame, compelled to serve wine at the very banquet celebrating their city's destruction. The Mongols understood the anatomy of humiliation, the way it destroyed the soul faster than fire could destroy flesh. Their genius was not in inventing new forms of cruelty, but in perfecting them through repetition until horror became administration and suffering became law. Among the empire's inner councils, even the act of sparing someone was calculated to wound. To execute a man swiftly was to grant him dignity. To enslave his family was to stain his afterlife. The Mongols weaponized this understanding with cold precision. They forced the survivors of high-ranking enemies into marriage with their own subordinates, ensuring that royal bloodlines were mingled and degraded. In doing so, they dismantled dynastic continuity, the backbone of every pre-modern civilization, replacing it with a new order in which ancestry was diluted, language corrupted, and memory confused. The wives of the defeated, once symbols of pride and purity, were now transformed into living instruments of propaganda. Their survival was the empire's proof of absolute control. To the people who saw them afterward, adorned in Mongol garments and speaking the conqueror's tongue, they became walking reminders that resistance had no meaning. Yet the darkest revelation lay not in the brutality itself, but in how it was justified. The Mongols, guided by their shamanic beliefs and the philosophy of the eternal blue sky, considered themselves divine arbiters, chosen by the heavens to reshape the earth. Every act of conquest was framed as cosmic balance. Every atrocity was a ritual offering. They saw the humiliation of the conquered as a purification of sin, a cosmic reset ordained by fate. Women of defeated nations were not merely spoils of war. They were instruments of renewal, carriers of the conqueror's divine seed. Within this warped cosmology, degradation was sanctified, and mercy was a violation of the natural order. The commanders invoked this logic to discipline their men, reminding them that what they did to the wives of enemies was not an act of cruelty, but a sacrament of power. It was empire as theology, violence as faith. In the royal encampments, the Khan's decree transformed this belief into bureaucracy. Records were kept of every captured woman of noble birth, her lineage documented, and her fate assigned with imperial precision. Some were taken into the harem of the great Khan himself, where politics and punishment intertwined. There a woman's worth was measured not by her beauty or virtue, but by how effectively her existence erased the identity of her people. The Mongols even institutionalized rituals of forced renewal, where captives were made to swear allegiance through ceremonies of symbolic submission that blurred the lines between religion, obedience, and desecration. Chroniclers describe these events with restrained horror: golden tents illuminated by torchlight, drums beating like hearts of the sky, and women kneeling before idols of conquest, while soldiers chanted praises to Tengri. The spectacle was so vast and so organized that it resembled worship, except the god being praised was victory itself. This bureaucratized cruelty extended across the empire's administrative branches. Local governors, eager to demonstrate loyalty, replicated these practices in miniature, enforcing the same ideology across Persia, Khorasan, and even into the Rus's territories. The degradation of women became a political language, a way to signal allegiance to Mongol supremacy. A captured general's widow, presented as a concubine to a Mongol commander, was not simply a private act. It was a message written in flesh, announcing to the conquered that their gods, kings, and laws had been defeated even within the sacred chambers of their homes. The empire turned humiliation into a diplomatic art so refined that no sword was needed once the pattern was understood. People learned to surrender before the siege began because they feared what surrender would look like if delayed. What made this system so horrifying was its efficiency.
It required no excess, no spectacle of random cruelty. Every act was purposeful, recorded, and justified. The Mongol chroniclers themselves admitted that terror was their most useful weapon, not because it killed, but because it lingered. It hollowed out entire civilizations from within, leaving shells that still functioned, still traded, still prayed, but no longer believed in their own sanctity. And beneath that quiet continuation, the wives of the fallen remained the silent architects of empire, living memorials to submission. Their suffering the invisible mortar binding together lands that could never have been united by force alone. In this light, the Mongol conquest reveals a truth more disturbing than any battlefield massacre: that the most effective form of domination is psychological, and the most enduring empire is built not on corpses but on corrupted memory. Through their calculated use of degradation, the Mongols discovered how to colonize the human soul. They proved that to erase a people, you need not destroy their cities. You only need to ensure that their children inherit shame instead of pride, silence instead of song. And so as the Mongol Empire grew into the largest contiguous dominion in history, stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the heart of Europe, its foundations were laid, not merely with conquest and law, but with the tears of those whose suffering was never recorded, whose faces faded into anonymity beneath the empire's golden banners. What historians later called the Pax Mongolica, the so-called peace of the Mongols, was for millions a peace enforced by memory mutilation. The roads were safe, the trade routes flourishing, but beneath that surface glimmered the ghostly echo of voices that had been silenced. The empire's greatness was built upon the ruins of its victims' humanity, upon the systematic transformation of grief into obedience, and in the haunting aftermath of every victory, there remained only the whisper that history cannot cleanse, that what the Mongols did to the wives of the defeated was not an act of war, but an art of annihilation, so complete, so calculated that even death itself seemed merciful by comparison. When the empire of the Mongols finally fractured under the weight of its own enormity, when the banners that once darkened the horizon were folded and forgotten, the world that remained was quieter, but not cleansed. The ashes of the past had settled, but beneath them, memory still breathed. The roads that Genghis Khan had carved with terror became arteries of commerce. The cities that had once burned were rebuilt into centers of learning and trade. Yet every stone of those rebuilt walls carried the memory of screams that had never been recorded, of women whose names had been erased so thoroughly that even their descendants spoke the conqueror's language without realizing that their tongues were the monuments of submission. History moved on, as it always does, but the shadow of what had been done never truly disappeared. It simply learned to whisper instead of wail. The brilliance of Mongol statecraft, celebrated in modern textbooks for its administrative genius and tolerance of religion, was built upon a paradox that few dare to confront: that civilization itself can grow from the soil of annihilation. The same hands that opened the Silk Road had once torn the veils from royal daughters. The same rulers who enforced laws against theft had codified human ownership. Empires are often remembered for their architecture, their trade, and their innovations in governance. But what endures longest are the invisible structures, the psychological architectures of power and fear. The Mongols understood that to dominate bodies was simple, but to dominate memory required something far more insidious. They rewrote the very notion of womanhood, turning it from a symbol of continuity into proof of conquest. Through this transformation, they achieved a kind of immortality that monuments could never grant, a living legacy carried in bloodlines, languages, and silences. For centuries afterward, entire regions would carry traces of Mongol descent, a genetic echo of the empire's theology of control. But those bloodlines are more than biological. They are historical, metaphysical, and almost spectral. They remind us that empire never ends cleanly. It seeps forward, through inheritance and story, through names that no longer know their origins. The wives of the defeated did not vanish. They became the quiet foundations of a new world order. Their suffering was woven into the very continuity that the conquerors sought to claim. In the stillness of history's archives, their absence is its own kind of presence. A silence so vast it becomes the background against which all later empires define themselves. Every future conqueror, from Tower to the Ottomans to the European colonizers, would imitate the same psychology: dominate the body, then dominate the story. And perhaps that is the most chilling revelation of all, that cruelty, when practiced with conviction, can disguise itself as destiny. The Mongols believed they were chosen by the eternal blue sky, that their rule was the correction of a cosmic imbalance. But to those who lived beneath that rule, the balance was never restored. It was buried in the ruins of the steppe, where the wind still sings through the bones of forgotten cities. The ghosts of those women remain, not as victims, but as witnesses. They remind us that every empire calls itself eternal, yet none survive the echo of their own crimes. So when you hear the stories of Mongol glory, the speed of their armies, the brilliance of their law, and the vastness of their trade, remember the silence that built it. Remember the wives of the fallen whose suffering made peace possible, whose eraser became the ink of history. And ask yourself, as every generation must, when power demands the rewriting of humanity, when survival itself is twisted into surrender, what then is worse than death? Before you go, if you believe that the truths buried beneath history deserve to be uncovered, if you wish to walk with us again through the corridors of darkness, where forgotten voices still echo, then subscribe and tell us below. Which of these horrors haunts you the most? Because the shadows of empire have not faded.